Beneath the cobbled streets of forgotten kingdoms, there are doors no light has ever touched. Stone mouths in the earth, sealed by rusted iron, and prayers whispered too late. This is not a tale of castles or kings, but of the shadows they cast below. In the Middle Ages, dungeons were not just prisons. They were theaters of silence, where screams were swallowed by stone. Altars to fear, built not to hold men, but to break them. Some say the devil himself designed these places brick by brick, with ceilings too low for hope and darkness too deep for memory. Tonight, we descend, not into history, but into the marrow of cruelty. And if you listen closely, you may still hear them. The breathing walls, the rattling chains, the secrets that were never meant to leave. The year was 1253, and the sun set in crimson behind the towers of Château de Faugueret, a stronghold draped in ivy, perched on the edge of the Vienne River, beautiful, majestic, and hollowed out from beneath like a corpse with its ribs carved away. Few knew what lay under its vaulted halls. Even fewer returned to speak of it. In that time, dungeons were not yet called dungeons. They were oubliettes, the forgotten places. Derived from the French word oubliettes, to forget, the name was not poetic, but painfully literal. When a man was thrown in, the world was expected to forget he had ever lived. No trial, no last rites. Only a hole in the ground and a scream sealed behind stone. Under the great dining chamber of Château de Faugueret, past a hidden door masked in ornamental wood, there was such a place. A spiral stair, so narrow even breath felt crushed, led to a chamber that never saw the sun. No torches were lit there. Not because they couldn't be, but because light was mercy and mercy was forbidden. It was in this oubliette that the first whispers of cruelty began to echo through the noble houses of Poitou. A boy of 12, the son of a lesser baron, was accused of stealing a golden ring from the count's own table. He was dragged not to court, but to the stone below. His crime was petty, his punishment eternal. Witnesses later claimed the boy was thrown down a shaft barely wide enough for his frame, landing in a pit 8 feet deep, surrounded by walls too smooth to climb. No food, no water, only time and rats. He lived for 4 days. On the 5th, they heard nothing. The shaft was sealed with mortar, as if he had never been. But the boy was only the beginning. Word of the oubliettes spread, not in court documents or proclamations, but in wine-soaked murmurs between visiting nobles. As faith, they began to imitate it. Not out of necessity, but fascination. What could stone do to the soul, they wondered? How long could a mind survive in silence, in cold, in blackness thick enough to choke? By 1267, the dungeon beneath Faugueret had claimed 17 lives. And it had grown. No longer just a pit, but a corridor of cells, carved with malicious precision. The walls were angled ever so slightly inward, so a prisoner felt the pressure of the building itself pressing on their thoughts. Ceilings sloped, not to conserve space, but to ensure no man could stand tall. The builders were nameless. They were never paid in coin, only pardons. Many were former prisoners themselves, promised freedom if they helped sculpt the very tombs that had nearly claimed them. One such man, a mason named Lucien, kept a journal smuggled out through his daughter. He wrote, "This place was made not of stone and sweat, but of curses. Each brick screams the name of someone buried beneath it. I do not build walls, I build forgetting." No record of Lucien was found after 1269, only his final entry, written in shaking charcoal. They say the Count visits the dungeon not to imprison, but to listen. Some scholars dismiss the tales of Château de Faugueret's dungeon as medieval folklore, exaggerated by time and rumor. But in 1971, during a restoration of the southern tower, workers uncovered a sealed trapdoor. Below it, they found bones, dozens, and a space precisely 8 feet deep with walls too smooth to climb. and carved into the stone beneath layers of dust and centuries of silence were 4 words scratched by hand: I was not alone. Beneath the winding, cobbled streets of Norwich, that ancient English town whispered about by monks and merchants alike, there lies another secret, not of treasure nor of saints, but of silence, the kind of silence that grows teeth. They called it simply the Hollow, though it had no name in royal records, no place in church ledgers. It wasn't built by decree or by law. It was born like fungus in the underbelly of necessity when fear became more potent than justice. It began in the late 12th century, during the reign of Henry II, a time of turbulent rebellion and papal tensions. Heresy was a word used not for blasphemers alone, but for the inconvenient. Midwives, herbalists, stammering monks with strange ideas. They all began to disappear. Some blamed the church, others blamed the crown, but no one dared search too deep. For every time a man asked too many questions, he too was gone. The Hollow was not a dungeon in the traditional sense. There were no cells, no chains on walls. Only corridors, miles of them, dug and carved by candlelight under the chalk and clay. Some so narrow one had to breathe sideways. Others vast, cathedral-like, echoing with phantom footsteps, but always cold, always damp, and always darker than the eye could adjust. The few who returned, and there were only 3, described it with eyes that refused to focus. One, a vagrant named Matthew Fenn, found wandering the edge of the forest after being missing for months, repeated only one phrase until his death: "The walls speak when you sleep." He died with soil beneath his fingernails and scratches across his tongue. According to a set of forbidden monastic letters now kept under lock and seal at Cambridge, the Hollow was used as an unofficial holding ground for suspected enemies of the church, but there was no interrogation, no torture devices. Instead, prisoners were left in total isolation, no sound, no human contact, only time and the noise of their own minds echoing endlessly off the chalk walls. What made the Hollow particularly cruel was its design. Hidden throughout its tunnels were slits, thin as a finger, that carried sound from other prisoners miles away. Not enough to form words, just enough to confuse the senses. A cough, a scream, a breath that seemed to come from nowhere. Over days, the victims began to hallucinate. Over weeks, they lost all language. By the 2nd month, if they were still alive, they had forgotten their own names. In 1194, a secret order of monks from the Priory of St. Julian wrote that the Hollow was a place not of death, but of unraveling. One monk, Brother Emmerich, documented the case of a woman imprisoned for the crime of possessing 3 books written in Latin, books women were not allowed to own. His final words regarding her: "She went silent on the 13th day, not from fear, but from absence. It was as though she had been erased while still breathing." The Hollow was eventually sealed by order of King John after a nobleman's son vanished in Norwich without a trace. Rumors swelled that he had been taken not for treason, but because he knew too much about what lay beneath the priory. The tunnels were collapsed with fire and stone, and the entrances forgotten till 1928. During repairs after World War I, the construction team discovered a partial chamber beneath St. Julian's. No official excavation was done, but one worker kept a diary. It was never published. In it, he writes, "There were bones, yes, but it wasn't the bones that shook me. It was the writing on the wall. Not carved, not painted. Scratched, faint, as if by teeth. Just one word repeated over and over, all around the walls, dozens of times. Shadows." High atop the mistrapped hills of Baden-Württemberg, where the wind tastes of iron and forgotten oaths, stands the Hohenzollern Castle. Regal, grand, and drenched in a silence so heavy it presses against the bones. Tourists today see a fairy tale fortress, spires and courtyards, stonework lit golden by the sun. But beneath its polished halls, beneath the arches and the banners of German glory, lies a chamber once known as Der Eiserne Chor, the Iron Choir. It is not found on any modern map. The stairwell to it has long been bricked over, the door sealed behind a false wall in what is now a wine cellar. But the old records remain, hidden in the margins of family ledgers pressed between psalms in the family Bible, evidence of a place not built for prisoners, but for penance. It began in the winter of 1448, under Count Wilhelm IV, a man known less for cruelty than for his obsession with divine order. Following a string of peasant revolts and noble betrayals, Wilhelm grew convinced that punishment alone was not enough. "The soul must learn to sing again," he wrote, "and it can only do so after suffering has cleared its throat." He commissioned the Iron Choir in secret. 16 iron cells arranged in a circle beneath the chapel. Each the size of a coffin stood on end with narrow grates at the front, so the prisoners could hear but barely see each other. The walls were lined with metallic slats, designed to vibrate and resonate with any sound made within. A moan could echo for minutes. A whisper became a chorus, and screams became symphonies. But these were not dungeons in the usual sense. There were no torturers, no thumbscrews. Instead, prisoners, usually political dissenters, minor heretics, even disobedient sons, were placed into the cells with no contact, no light, and no concept of time. But once a day, the chamber above would be used for choir practice. Monks would sing psalms, hymns, Gregorian chants. Their voices filtered through grates into the cells below, not as beauty, but as agony. One priest later confessed that the acoustics turned the sacred into shrieking. It was as if holiness itself was a whip. The goal, Count Wilhelm insisted, was redemption through resonance, a spiritual purification. And if some did not survive the process, well, only the damned fear divine music. What happened to those within is not fully known. But in 1481, a young page named Marcus Schiller, who had spent 3 days cleaning the floor above the chamber, recorded this in his diary. "On the second night, I could not sleep. I heard them, not the monks, not the choir, but the prisoners, or what was left of them. A low hum, at first discordant, but then harmony. As if 16 souls had lost their minds so deeply they found a melody beyond reason. It was believed that some prisoners, in their isolation, began to mimic the hymns, humming incessantly, tapping their fingers against the metal walls until the sound consumed their identities. In one recovered cell door, preserved in a vault beneath Berlin, there is an inscription scratched by a fingernail. Heaven is a sound that eats you." The chamber was finally sealed after the death of Wilhelm's grandson, Friedrich I, whose own wife reportedly disappeared for 2 years and returned unable to speak, her hands permanently clenched as if gripping iron bars. No one dared ask where she had been. Today, no tours mention the Iron Choir, but those who sleep in the east wing of the castle report strange dreams. Dreams of chanting, dreams of metal bending, and sometimes, just before waking, the distinct sensation of being watched by someone behind a grate. Not with anger, but with anticipation. In the dry heart of southern Italy, where the Apulian wind whispers through olive trees and the sun hardens every shadow like chiseled obsidian, there stands a structure both elegant and inexplicable. Castel del Monte, built in the 13th century by Emperor Frederick II. The castle's perfect octagonal symmetry has baffled historians for centuries. No moat, no defensive towers, no chapel. It is a place that should not feel ominous yet does, as if its perfection conceals something grotesque behind the geometry. Tourists marvel at its mathematical beauty, but few realize that beneath its foundation lies a place known only through fragments of court letters and whispered records. La Gabbia dell'Aveto, the widow's cage. This dungeon was not constructed like others. No chains, no executioners, Just a single octagonal chamber mirroring the castle above, with a smooth, sloping floor and walls of white limestone. In the center, a metal cage hung suspended from the ceiling by a massive rusted chain. It was not built to hold criminals. It was built to contain one person. A woman. Her name, if it was ever spoken, has been lost. All that remains are documents from Frederick's physician, who wrote, "She does not age, and yet she does not live. Her silence corrupts the minds of those who guard her. I fear her grief may outlast stone." The legend begins in 1248, when Frederick returned from the east with treasure silks, texts, relics, but also with a woman cloaked in black, her face veiled and her presence commanding. No one knew where she came from. She never spoke. And yet, she never left his side. Court rumors named her the widow, though no one ever saw her weep. One evening, during a feast held under a blood-red moon, she was seen whispering in Frederick's ear. The next morning, the court astrologer was found dead, his lips sewn shut with golden thread. Soon after, the emperor's favored general drowned in his own bath, though the tub was dry. Frederick grew paranoid, obsessed. He built a chamber beneath Castel del Monte with exacting dimensions. Designed to hold that which has no form, the widow was led into it without resistance. She entered the cage, draped in black, and sat cross-legged on the iron floor, as if she had been waiting for centuries. And then she began to sing. Not songs, not words. A hum, low, constant, resonating through the limestone chamber. Guards describe the sound as a lament felt in the teeth. Those stationed near the chamber grew ill. Some lost their sight. Others carved spirals into their skin, saying they needed to feel the shape of her voice. One letter, smuggled from a scribe named Tommaso in 1251, reads, "I heard her through the floorboards. My unborn child stopped moving. My ink turned black. She sings for someone who will never return, and she will not die until they come." The widow's cage was finally sealed by Frederick's successors. Not out of mercy, but out of necessity. The chain was cut, the cage collapsed. Limestone was poured into the stairwell, and the entry was forgotten or deliberately unremembered. But the ground beneath Castel del Monte still hums at night, they say. If you lie flat against the foundation stones, you might feel it. A vibration. A sorrow that has outlasted memory. And once modern archaeologist reported, on a seismic reading, an anomaly. A slow, rhythmic pulsing. Like breath. No one goes below now. Because what if she's still there, not waiting to escape, but waiting to be heard? Far to the west, where the moors of Devon roll like waves beneath a permanent fog, there is a ruined priory built on forgotten soil Tavistock Abbey, once the jewel of the Benedictine order. It is now nothing more than fragmented stones and moss-covered memory. But deep beneath its collapsed cloisters lies a crypt that was never meant to be unearthed. A place once called the Pit of St. Rumen. At the center of the pit is a well no water, no bottom, just a shaft hewn into the earth, its walls blackened with soot, its breath cold even in summer. According to a single manuscript found in the Vatican archives, the pit was not made by monks, but discovered by them in the 11th century beneath the foundations of the abbey itself. And what they found within it, they could not explain. The manuscript, dated 1046, tells of a boy named Giles, an orphan taken in by the abbey at the age of 7. He never spoke, not once, but he listened too well. At night, when the bells had ceased and the chants had ended, he would sit atop the abbey stones and tilt his head as if absorbing voices no one else could hear. One night, Giles led the abbot and 3 monks down into the lower catacombs where they found the well. Giles pointed, then turned away. The monks, at first skeptical, lowered a torch down into the darkness. It was extinguished before reaching the bottom. They tried again with rope, with candles, with prayers. Each time, the flame vanished into blackness, as though consumed by something not quite wind, not quite water. Finally, they lowered a small bell tied to a cord. The bell rang 3 times, soft, sharp, then slow. Then silence. Giles, still mute, began scratching circles into the stone floor with his fingernails. When asked, he dipped his finger into the soot and wrote 3 words on the wall. He is listening. Over the next year, 13 monks vanished from the abbey. Always at night, always near the crypt. Some left behind nothing but garments, others only teeth. The abbot ordered the well sealed, mortared in with iron crosses and sacred salt. The abbey bells rang continuously for 7 days to purge the darkness. Giles was found curled near the well, eyes wide open. Lips burned black, as though he had whispered too close to flame. He died that winter, fingers still curled in a gesture of silence. But the story does not end with his death. In 1349, when the Black Death reached Devon, the abbey was reopened to shelter the dying. Grave pits overflowed. The monks, desperate for space, broke the old seal on the crypt. They heard the bell again, only once. And all those who descended to tend to the dead never returned. A traveler asked journal from 1651 records, seeing a strange woman in black walking the ruins of Tavistock. Pausing at a stone slab and tilting her head as if listening, the traveler approached. She looked up and whispered, "He still listens, and now he remembers." Some say the well was a gate, others call it a prison. But if it was the latter, then it was built long before man, long before monks, long before memory. And if what lay beneath was a prisoner, then who was the jailer? And what happened to him? The pit of St. Rumen remains sealed. But those who visit the abbey ruins sometimes report a strange sound at night, like metal dragging stone. A deep breath drawn in from far below, waiting. In the bustling heart of the Hanseatic League, where merchants once chanted the language of gold across cobbled streets and wooden docks, stood the city of Bremen, a jewel of trade, of art, of order. But beneath its civic facade, deeper than any merchant vault, there existed a secret chamber, not recorded on maps nor mentioned in any town ledger. The people called it Eisenchur, the Iron Choir. It was not always a place of horror. In its earliest form, the Eisenchur was a crypt for heretics. Sealed by the clergy in the late 12th century to silence those deemed too dangerous to live or die freely. They were chained standing, their mouths pried open with iron hooks, left to rot in unnatural silence. The monks believed that such arrangements prevented the dead from speaking blasphemy in the afterlife. But over time, something changed. The first to notice were the bell ringers at St. Peter's Cathedral. They spoke of distant humming beneath their feet, too deep to be heard, clearly more felt than perceived. Not the moaning of wind, nor the shifting of stone, but something melodic. A harmony not made by human voice, nor by divine choir. Then came the children. Every generation or so, a child would disappear in Bremen, vanishing from locked homes. From behind drawn curtains, sometimes even from their mother's arms. Always at night, always when the bells failed to ring the midnight hour. The townsfolk whispered that the iron choir was calling again. In 1423, a young apprentice named Matthias Gerhardt, barely 16. Orphaned, Curious decided to descend into the old foundations beneath the crypt. During renovation, work ordered by the bishopric. He kept a journal, which was later found hidden in a hollowed wall behind the altar. It described narrow corridors chiseled with unholy symbols of voices that hummed in perfect intervals without breath. The farther Matthias went, the more he wrote of a sound so beautiful, so pure, that it made him weep blood. Then, one final line, scrawled with shaking hand. The choir is not singing, it's breathing. No one saw Matthias again. Afterward, the bishopric sealed the Eisenchur once more, but not with stone or timber. They cast molten lead into its gate. And in the dead of night, They poured silver shavings into the cracks while chanting psalms in Latin and something else, something older. Still, the bells sometimes falter. And when they do, the people of Bremen do not pray. They hum, a low, droning note, as if to mask something, or answer it. In the 19th century, during an expansion of the city's underground rail system, workers stumbled upon a corridor beneath the cathedral marked with rusted iron loops embedded into the walls at shoulder-height bindings. Clearly ancient, a T fled the site. The tunnel was closed. The government denied its existence. A T tourists today still visit St. Peter's. They take photographs, admire the vaulted ceilings. But sometimes, in recordings, beneath the clatter of footsteps and the murmur of guides, you can hear something. A chord, faint, hollow, like a song sung by mouths long dead, still trying to be heard. South of the Rhine, where lavender fields once cloaked the earth in the scent of sleep, lies Avignon, city made sacred by popes, scholars, and sins. Among its relics and broken chapels, the locals speak only in hush when asked about La Fosse des Veuves. The Widow's Pit. It was said to be built in the 14th century under the palace of the popes, though no official record dares name it. In truth, it was never meant for criminals, nor heretics, nor even traitors. It was made ... for women. Specifically, widows who were considered inconvenient. It began with the Black Death. When the plague swept Avignon, death came not only in coughs and boils, but in fear. Widows inherited property, money, power, influence. And in a world ruled by men and monasteries, that was dangerous. Some say it was Pope Clement VI, himself desperate to maintain divine order, who gave whispered permission to the Brotherhood of Silence to begin the removals. They came at night, cloaked, gloved, gentle. They never broke the door. They never left a mark. But in the morning, a widow's bed would be empty, still warm, her tea still steaming. And beneath the palace, in the hidden cellars, her cries would begin. The widow's pit was not a dungeon in the traditional sense. It had no bars, no chains. It was a well deep, circular, lined with stones slick from centuries of breath and despair. At the bottom, women sat, dozens, not hundreds, thousands, over time. Each layer of dust, a layer of history. They were left with nothing but scraps, memories, and each other's stories. But it wasn't the hunger that broke them. It was the mirror. In the center of the pit, suspended on a chain from the ceiling, hung a brass-framed mirror, constantly turning in the faint drafts. A relic of unknown origin. It did not reflect the present, but moments' echoes of their past. A child's laughter, a husband's final breath, the last time they saw the sun. And as they watched, some began to speak to it, whispered to it, beg it to lie. Over time, the mirror began to answer. One survivor, Madame Elise Renaud, rescued during the Revolution when the palace was stormed, spoke of the mirror in her old age. Her words were dismissed as madness, but she repeated them even on her deathbed. It does not show what was. It shows what should have been. And that is worse. No one believed her. Until 1891, when restoration work beneath the palace revealed a circular shaft lined with gnawed bone and rusted rosaries. The workers found the mirror still suspended and tarnished, untouched by time. A scholar named Henry Drac attempted to remove it. His assistants later found him staring into the glass, eyes wide, mouth silently moving as if trapped mid-prayer. He never spoke again. The mirror was placed in storage, then vanished. Today, no tour of Avignon mentions the pit, but some visitors claim to hear singing beneath their feet, soft, distant, entirely female. A harmony not of joy, but of mourning, as if the pit remembers, and perhaps it still waits for the next widow. In the northern mists of the Hanseatic League, where trade once flowed like blood through the arteries of old Europe, stood the proud merchant city of Lübeck, wealthy, walled, adorned with Gothic spires. But beneath its cobbled streets, where the stench of the Trave River clung to the stone, was a secret chamber known only as Die Reddenkamer, the Rat Keep. Built in 1287, the Rat Keep was never documented in legal charters. It did not need to be. It was passed down by word and fear among the city's ruling aldermen, a place reserved not for criminals, but for debtors who had offended the guilds. The punishment was not meant to kill. That was the horror of it. A man brought to the Rat Keep would be stripped of his shoes and his surname. The door would close behind him, thick oak bound in black iron, and the only thing he would hear for hours, sometimes days, was scratching. Rats, hundreds, but these were not wild. They were bred, fat, bold, hungry, starved purposefully for days. They had never known fields or rivers, only stone, straw, and the smell of warm flesh. A small copper pipe ran from the chamber into the slaughterhouse above, dripping blood at a regulated pace, just enough to keep them alert. Expectant, there were no chains in the Rat Keep. No torture racks, just you and them, and time. They would not come at once. First, they would watch, sniff, crawl across your lap, taste your breath as you slept. Then, one would bite. Small, almost polite, a toe, an earlobe. If you screamed, it would excite the others. It was not pain that broke men in the Rat Keep. It was dehumanization. Merchants who once debated grain prices in silk robes were reduced to whimpering in straw, begging rats for mercy. Some began to speak to them, name them, offer them fingers like gifts to appease their appetite. Many went mad, but one did not. Wilhelm Note, a fur trader from Jadask, was thrown into the keep in 1342 for cheating the Salt Guild. He lasted 9 days, a record, and when the aldermen finally opened the door to drag out his remains, they found him alive and smiling. He had killed 3 rats, skinned them, worn them like epaulettes. "They crowned me their king," he whispered, laughing. He died a week later, blood loss, infection. But not before scratching a warning into the stone wall with a rat's tooth. Better to rule among vermin than kneel, okay? Among men, after Wilhelm, something changed. The rats became stranger, more aggressive. Some said they learned, knew how to wait, how to manipulate fear. By 1360, 5 more men died within 2 days of entering, a pace unheard of. Finally, in 1371, the guilds ordered the chamber sealed. Not out of guilt, out of fear. Today, the chamber remains bricked off beneath a butcher shop in Old Lübeck. But the floor above it still creaks at night, and workers claim they sometimes hear soft chewing beneath the tiles. One claimed his daughter was bitten in her sleep by something too large for a rat, too deliberate in its motion. He moved away the next morning, didn't even pack. There are no official records of the Rat Keep, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. It only means those who built it still understand silence. High in the hills of Burgundy, where the mists cling to the stones like memory to guilt, there once stood a modest abbey. Normand, it was not grand, not gilded. The monks there did not sing nor copy scripture. They listened, and below their chapel, buried in the chalky earth, was a room known only to the confessors, a place not for penance, but for containment. They called it La Chapelle Moute, the silent chapel. To speak of it was to invite it. To descend into it was to abandon hope. It began with Father Ambroise, a priest of great talent and darker conviction. In 1305, he was said to hear voices not from God, but from the mouths of men as they died. He claimed their last confessions were not words, but echoes, trapped in their throats, bouncing against their ribs, waiting to be released. He built the chapel to catch them. Beneath the altar, a spiral staircase to 73 steps, each carved with a line of psalm, led to a chamber shaped like a womb, with walls of smooth stone that curved inward toward a central dais. On that dais, a single wooden chair facing a hole in the wall. Not a window, a mouth, Carved like a mask of agony, it bore no decoration, only a deep cavity that led into a narrow tunnel lined with metal. Father Ambroise called it the receiver. Prisoners were not chained here. They were invited to confess, alone, in silence, in darkness, for hours, days. What made this dungeon terrifying was not its cruelty, but its purpose. There was no judgment, no punishment, only listening. Many did confess. They would sit in the chair, weeping, whispering their sins into the receiver. And then they would stop and never speak again. When the monks returned, they found them catatonic, still alive, still breathing, but their minds somewhere else. Somewhere beneath the stone. Not all were silent, however. One prisoner, Matilda de Sers, a heretic accused of poisoning an entire monastery, screamed for 3 days. Not in pain. In laughter, she swore the tunnel had spoken back. He listens, she cackled. But he also remembers. No one knows who he was. In 1312, after a string of inexplicable deaths among the brothers of Noirmont, each found with mouths open, tongues blackened, the abbey was abandoned. The silent chapel sealed. But some believe the receiver still works. In 1984, an underground survey near the ruins detected a strange resonance coming from below. An engineer who descended alone with a parabolic microphone described what he heard as a choir of whispers, all reciting different scenes at once. He refused to share the recording. Burned the tape, left the profession. To this day, pilgrims still leave notes at the edge of the ruins, scribbled prayers, regrets, names of the dead. They say if you sit quietly near the old chapel, just before dawn, you'll hear faint murmurs, like breath moving through a flute. You won't understand them, but they will understand you. And if you listen long enough, you may hear your own voice among them. Beneath the cliffs of Liguria, where the sea crashes like war drums against jagged rock, stands the crumbled skeleton of Castel Vernazza. Tourists flock to its windswept towers, unaware that its most compelling story lies not above, but below, hidden in a hollowed gut of stone and salt. They call them La Selle Crémassée, the crimson cells, but this red was not of paint nor rust. It was of something warmer, something that never quite washed away. In 1271, Vernazza fell into the hands of Girolamo dei Bori, a warlord turned inquisitor. Unlike others of his kind, Girolamo disdained public executions. Fear, he wrote, blooms best in silence. So he ordered the castle's lower vaults to be carved into an oubliette prison of memory, not just of flesh. Each crimson cell was barely wide enough for a man to sit curled. There were no doors, only round iron lids at the top, like wells, where prisoners were lowered by rope and forgotten. But the true horror was not the confinement, it was the walls. Carved into them inch by inch, name by name, were the confessions of previous inmates, not written in chalk or soot, but in blood. Dried into veins of testimony, sentences etched with fingertips and fingernails. Names of children, towns razed, lovers betrayed. Each new prisoner arrived not to solitude, but to a chorus of sin, preserved in dark red against cold stone. And the rule was simple. You were not permitted to leave until you had added your own. It was said the guards would lower a knife, small, rusted, ceremonial. You could use it however you liked. But the ink must come from you. Many carved nothing, hoping to survive by silence. They did not, because every few days Girolamo himself would descend, not to speak, not to taunt, but to read. He would stand over the lids, his voice floating down like a priest at communion. What have you added to the ledger? Those who had not written were left in darkness another week. Those who had lied, so judged by the inquisitor as uncanny gift for spotting deceit, were punished in ways never recorded, only implied. Some said they were pulled back up with eyes removed or tongues reversed, surgically pinned to the roofs of their mouths. One story tells of Brother Luca, a monk accused of harboring heretics. He resisted confession for 17 days, praying aloud in his pit, reciting psalms until his throat tore. On the 18th day, he carved a single word: forgive. He was never seen again. But the cell remained wet for months. When Castel Vernazza finally fell in 1303, its conquerors found the lower chambers and dared open 3 of the crimson cells. What they found made even the most hardened soldiers retch, not just from the decay, but from the faces on the walls. You see, some had not carved words at all, but portraits, expressions contorted in guilt, grief, horror, as if trying to immortalize not who they were, but what they had become. The last known mention of the crimson cells appears in a 17th-century traveler's journal. He wrote of hearing whispers beneath his feet as he slept in the ruins and dreamt of dozens of eyeless men, clawing from beneath the stones, begging not to be remembered, but to be believed. Today, Castel Vernazza stands as a postcard of Italian charm. But if you find yourself near the southern wall, where the grass grows strangely red, press your ear to the ground. You might still hear the scratching, still carving, still waiting to be finished. In the forgotten foothills of Slovakia stands Cactus Castle, its silhouette forever torn against the dusk like a broken crown. The world remembers it tiff at all as the lair of the infamous Countess Elizabeth, the Blood Countess. But few speak of what lies beneath it, and fewer still have seen the chapel that prays with iron. Long before the Countess, when the castle was no more than a crude fortress, the lords of the region built a private crypt beneath its chapel, but not for burial, for atonement. This was no sanctuary. It was a cell shaped like a prayer, narrow, arched, and suffocating. Known as the Iron Prayer Room, its sole occupant was called the penitent. According to monastery records from 1234, this penitent was a nobleman's son, a boy named Andrew who betrayed his father during an invasion by the Mongols. His treachery led to the death of dozens, including 3 monks and 2 knights. Rather than execute him, the abbot chose a holier punishment. He was sealed within the iron prayer room for life. A slot in the stone allowed food and water, but there was no exit. Inside the room was a kneeling bench welded to the floor, a cold metal crucifix affixed to the wall, and curiously small slits along the ceiling that allowed only moonlight to shine through. Each night, when the moon was high, that pale light struck the crucifix directly, illuminating the chamber in a spectral glow. And each night, they say, André would whisper prayers, not of forgiveness, but of memory. Over time, the monks outside noticed strange things. First, the iron in the room began to sweat despite the cold. Then, the stone beneath the crucifix turned black, as if burned from within. But most disturbing of all were the sounds, not screams, not sobs, but chanting, ancient, discordant, echoing with a harmony not of this world. When a new bishop ordered the cell opened in 1242, they found no trace of André. Only the kneeling bench now melted into the floor, the crucifix twisted as if it had been gripped by something with too many fingers. The room was resealed, but the chapel above remained. 2 centuries later, Countess arrived, and the castle remembered. She, too, built her own chambers below. She, too, believed in atonement, through pain, through blood. And she, too, came to the iron prayer room. In a letter uncovered from the 1600s, Elizabeth writes, "There is a stillness beneath the chapel that devours the soul. I have heard him pray." No one knows what she meant by him. Some claim she communed with André's spirit, forever chained in penitence. Others say it was no spirit at all, but what André had become. After Elizabeth's trial and imprisonment, the castle was looted and abandoned. The chapel was torn down, and the iron prayer room was sealed with lead. But in 1923, an amateur historian named Miroslav Dubček bribed workers to excavate the chamber. What he found was not a room, but a void. No crucifix. No bench. No floor. Just black walls, slick to the touch, and a single phrase scratched in Latin across the stone. Oravi odavit, non est Deus. Dubček never returned from Cactus. His belongings were found scattered around the ruined chapel, except for his crucifix, which had been twisted into a spiral, cold as death. Today, the villagers refuse to go near the hill after sunset. Dogs bark at nothing. Birds avoid its trees. And every now and then, a child is born in the valley, with a faint scar across the knees, as if from years of kneeling on iron. The castle still stands barely, but beneath its stones, the iron prayer continues, not in words, not in hope, but in waiting for the next soul to pray and to be heard. High in the Bavarian Alps, cradled in mist and myth, rests the monastery of Heiligenschein. Holy glow, a name whispered in reverence by pilgrims, and in fear by those who know what lies beneath. To the passing traveler, it appears as a sanctuary, white stone cloisters, golden altars, and monks gliding silently through candlelit halls. But beneath its pristine floors lies a dungeon unlike any other, known only by its whispered name, the Vault of Silence. It was built, or perhaps revealed, in the 9th century when the monastery was founded atop a site the Romans once marked as forbidden. Beneath the altar in the central chapel is a narrow staircase, carved not by monks but by something far older into a spiral so tight it can only be descended on one's knees. At the bottom, darkness, perfect and full. The vault contains no chains, no whips, no racks, and yet it has broken men more surely than any iron ever could. Inside, prisoners were sealed alone, without light, food, or sound. But they did not starve. They did not go mad. They prayed. Something prayed back. Historical records are sparse, almost deliberately vague. But a hidden ledger, discovered by accident in 1889, offers chilling detail. Its author was Brother Alaric, a monk of unshakable devotion and the dungeon's final warden. He wrote, "We do not feed them, we do not speak to them, yet they do not perish. Each morning I hear them whisper through the stone, not in agony, but in communion. They learn. They change." One inmate, a knight named Rudolf von Kael, was sealed in the vault after desecrating relics. After 3 months, the monks heard what they thought was Gregorian chant coming from the stone. When they opened the vault against every valve, but he had no eyes. They had not been gouged. They had vanished. He smiled. Then he whispered, "The light is gone. The real light is below." The monks resealed the vault. No one else was sent down. But things only grew stranger. The chapel above began to bleed wax from the walls. The candles burned black. And at night, the organ played by itself, melody in a scale not known to man. The abbot ordered the vault buried in stone, but Brother Alaric refused. He stayed behind. He said the silence spoke to him now, that it was not a prison, but a doorway. The last entry in his ledger reads, "The voice in the vault knows my name. It has always known. Tonight I descend, on my knees, into its breath." No one ever saw him again. In 1943, during the war, a Nazi unit occupied the monastery. Obsessed with occult lore, they reopened the vault. Of the 16 men who entered, only one returned mad hair, white, teeth cracked. He spoke only one phrase, over and over. It sang to us. It sang with our own voices. The monastery was abandoned. Nature crept in. Ivy clawed its walls. The bells fell silent. But still, the vault is there, hidden beneath a collapsed altar. It waits. Tourists today marvel at the architecture above, blind to what lies beneath their feet. The light that surrounds them is deceptive, a mask of divinity stretched thin over something hungry, ancient, and endlessly patient. And if you stand very still, just before dusk, some claim you can hear it. Not screaming, not crying, but praying. And in the hush between those prayers, something listens back. In the heart of Venice, where water and shadow dance together, a single passage runs beneath the Doge's palace, the Ponte dei Sospiri, or the Bridge of Sighs. Tourists know it today as a tragic landmark, a picturesque spot for photographs and lovers' lore. But few know the truth. The sighs the bridge was named for were not from condemned prisoners glimpsing their last view of the city. No, they were the echoes of something much stranger, drifting upward from the damp stone of the prison below. La Piove. The Leads was the name of the prison, a low-ceilinged labyrinth beneath the palace, roofed with heavy lead sheets that turned its upper cells into ovens in summer, iceboxes in winter. Yet it was not the heat or the cold that broke men there. It was what came after. Beneath the lower cells, far from any official registry, there was another chamber. The guards called it simply La Dimenticanza, the forgetting. No records remain of its construction. It was as if the chamber had always been there, waiting for the city to grow above it. La Dimenticanza was used sparingly, only for the most dangerous, the most inconvenient. Those whose existence had to be erased, not through death, but something worse. Erasure of memory, of identity. Prisoners placed in the chamber would last, on average, 30 days. No light, no chains, just silence. When they emerged, if they did, they had forgotten who they were. One guard, Matteo of the Red Sash, wrote in his journal in 1607, "We placed a merchant within, loud and proud. Knew his lineage back to Rome itself. 30 nights, then nothing. He did not remember his name, nor ours, nor his wife's. He asked if he had always been down there, if we were all part of the same dream. Worse still, some did not forget. They remembered different lives. A woman condemned for witchcraft spent 40 nights in the chamber. When pulled out, she whispered in Greek, though she'd only ever spoken Venetian dialect. She described herself as a priestess from Delphi, a servant of the old gods. Her gaze was blank, but her voice sang of fire. She tried to light her own cell on fire with her breath. They silenced her the next night, not with execution, with return. After another cycle in La Dimenticanza, she did not speak again. Some believed the chamber was cursed. Others claimed it was alive, that the architecture had a geometry not meant for human minds, angles that bled into dreams. The walls were made not just of stone, but of memory itself. There are reports from guards who began to forget their own names after standing outside the chamber too long. One wrote in despair, "I call myself Luca, but today I signed the registry as Gaius. The ink felt like blood. I dreamed I was in a sandstorm, and I wept for Rome, but I've never left Venice." By the 18th century, the chamber was sealed. Not for the safety of prisoners, but because the Doge himself began forgetting edicts he had written the week before. As if the air around the chamber was infectious, a miasma of oblivion. Today, beneath the palace, tour guides walk tourists along narrow passages and tell of Casanova's escape. They do not speak of La Dimenticanza. But some visitors claim their phones glitch near one unmarked stone wall. That for a split second, their photos show a person who isn't there. A figure in robes standing still, lips moving in silent prayer. When asked, the guides say it's just a trick of the light. But sometimes, those tourists forget where they left their bags or their names. Only for a moment, a breath. But La Dimenticanza is patient. And once it learns your name, it never forgets you. High in the Carpathian Mountains, hidden among endless pine and frost, stands the forgotten ruin of Cactus Castle. History remembers it only in whispers, entangled with the name of Elizabeth, the Blood Countess. But her crimes, dark as they were, have eclipsed another horror that once thrived beneath her ancestral home. They say the castle had a dungeon, not in the belly of the keep, but in its heart. A chamber not designed to punish, but to comfort. And that was what made it so terrifying. Its name has been lost to official records, but survivors, the very few who escaped, called it the nest. The nest did not use chains. It did not scream. There were no racks, no blades, no cells of stone. Instead, it welcomed you. When a prisoner arrived, they were brought through a long, carpeted corridor lined with mirrors that made no reflection. At the end, a door, polished wood, silver handle. Behind it, the dungeon. But it looked like home. A single bed with warm sheets. A fireplace that never needed fuel. A desk with parchment and ink which replenished each morning. Meals appeared in silence. Your favorites, even if you never spoke them aloud. Some said it even smelled like your childhood bedroom. No jailers came. No orders were shouted. And yet, no one left. The first days the prisoner would rejoice. This is mercy, they thought. This is luck. But then the stillness would begin to weigh. The fire, though warm, gave off no heat. The food, though savory, had no flavor. The sheets, though soft, never felt touched. It was all close, almost real, but not. And that was the trap. Some began to speak aloud, just to hear a voice. Others wrote letters, despite having no one to send them to. They read the same book, always the same book, over and over until the words began to change. One account, preserved in the letters of a Jesuit priest who entered the nest in 1602, reads, "The third night, I dreamed my mother called to me from the fireplace. But her voice came from inside my head. When I awoke, the fire spelled my name in the ashes." Another survivor told of phantoms in the mirrors. Not her own reflection, but another version of herself. Older eyes hollowed, smiling. Time in the nest moved strangely. Some said days passed in hours, others that weeks vanished like a breath. One woman believed she had stayed for 7 days. Her hair had turned white. When she was found by looters after the fall of the castle, her fingernails had grown inches long. Her diary showed 12 years of entries, and yet she swore, "I was only just brought here." The dungeon fed not on flesh or pain, but on longing. The ache of comfort twisted into madness. It gave you everything, until you couldn't remember why you wanted to leave. Eventually, the prisoner would forget they were a prisoner at all. They would stop pacing, stop questioning, stop dreaming. They would sit at the desk writing nothing, or curl into the bed and sleep, forever. When Elizabeth was arrested, the nest was sealed. Some say the final screams from within weren't screams at all, just the soft sound of someone asking for more time. Today, the ruins of Cactus are empty. But sometimes, on winter nights, hikers report a strange warmth near the eastern tower. The snow melts in perfect square outlines. Sometimes they say they smell lavender or stew. And if they listen closely, they hear the crackle of a fire. Behind a door that isn't there, the nest still waits. Because the most terrifying prison is not the one that hurts you. It's the one that loves you. Until you forget you were ever meant to be free. You have traveled with me through the bowels of medieval cruelty. Through darkness carved in stone, screams echoing off damp walls, and the broken minds of men who believed pain could purify the soul. But before you step back into the light, allow me to show you one last dungeon. One without bars, without chains, without locks or keys, and yet it may be the most terrifying of them all. They called it the cloister. Not a dungeon in the traditional sense, but a sacred space. A monastery often perched atop cliffs or buried deep within forests. From the outside, it looked peaceful. Birds sang. Incense drifted in the wind. The bells rang with the promise of salvation. But behind the silence lay a different kind of imprisonment. Here, the prisoners were not criminals. They were devoted. Monks, nuns, pilgrims seeking the divine. Some entered willingly. Others were sent by families ashamed of their minds. their desires, their dreams. It was not the body they sought to punish, but the spirit. Within these stone sanctuaries, a doctrine of self-erasure reigned. Voices were forbidden. Mirrors were shattered. Individual names were stripped away. Time itself lost all meaning. Bells divided the day, not by hours, but by prayer, penance, silence, and sleep. One monk, whose writings survived only because they were smuggled inside the spine of a hymn book, wrote, "They told me I must forget my name, forget I was ever born. Each day I wake and try to remember what it is I was supposed to forget. It follows me in dreams like a dog that once knew its master." In one cloister, known as Sanctum Mortis, those who broke their vows, who spoke without permission, or doubted the scriptures, were locked in a room called the Well. It was not deep. It was not even underground. It was simply a round, windowless cell where a single candle burned. Not enough to read. Just enough to see. You sat and you listened, and the silence began to whisper. They believed solitude would bring you closer to God, but sometimes solitude brought you closer to yourself. And for many, that was a fate worse than death. One nun, Sister Agnetha, after 20 years in cloister, clawed her own face in an attempt to remove the self she could no longer escape. She died not in sin, but in madness. Her final words, recorded by a frightened scribe, "He is not in the silence. He is in the noise I buried. And here lies the final truth. The greatest dungeon of the Middle Ages was not made of stone or iron. It was built from belief. Belief that suffering redeems. That the body must be denied. That doubt is a disease. That silence is holy. That to question is to damn." In the end, a dungeon is not always something someone builds for you. Sometimes it is something you build for yourself, a ritual you cannot escape, a memory you will not let go, a voice in your head that whispers you deserve this, and always have. So as we leave these haunted walls, I ask you only this. What part of your soul did you lock away? Someone told you it would save you. And is that prison still waiting? History does not repeat itself. It waits. It waits in shadow, in silence, in stone. And sometimes it waits inside you.